thank you so much for joining us today. We're very, very excited to be broadcasting live today from West London. I'm Charlotte Gentry, CEO and founder of the IVF Network. And today we are broadcasting live around the importance of corporate fertility benefits. And from the consumer point of view, if you're an employee, how do you feel safe in the corporate environment? How do you feel that you can have the right conversations around embarking on that IVF journey, and trying to understand how to mix the work and the fertility journey dynamic? It's not an easy thing to do, so we'll be discussing that today. And we'll also be talking to Lisa Finnegan, who is the Vice President of HR for LinkedIn. So we're delighted to have her with us today, who will be helping to give us some guidance on really what fertility benefits look like from the corporate perspective. So we'll be really honing in as well today on what corporate benefits should look like within the fertility arena. I'm very, very happy to introduce our chair today. So I won't be chairing the session. I'm handing over to Natalie Silverman, who is the founder and host of the Fertility Podcast, so we're delighted to have her with us today. And also Emma Cafton, who is the clinical director for the EveWell, who will be talking around some of the dynamics that she's experienced from the patient side of people trying to combine the work and the healthcare scenario for when they're going through that IVF journey.
Thank you, Charlotte. Now, as a starting point, one thing that we really need to hone in on is the importance of raising awareness of the diversity of the fertility journeys that people undergo, and how we can make them feel comfortable when it comes to starting these conversations. And Emma, when it comes to you and the exchanges that people are saying when they're coming in for fertility treatment, we know that people are so nervous as to how to even start to try and have these conversations. What kind of things do you advise?
Absolutely. Look, I think one of the most difficult things for us is that when you're looking at people embarking on their own fertility journey, you know, they've got so many things to consider. And it's striking to me that almost the number one question is, how can you facilitate this around my work? It must be a secret. I don't want my employer to know. And it's just so sad that that huge additional burden and stress is being placed on patients, I think unnecessarily. And in my experience, a lot of our patients work, and most of them are keeping it a secret. And I think it's about how do we facilitate that change and take that additional burden away from them.
Yeah, the mental health implications of going through treatment and struggling to conceive are so significant, considering we spend so much time at work. Lisa, it's so important, isn't it, that organisations understand that emotional toll. How can we start to try and educate companies about the mental health implications on their workforce from the outset?
I think honestly, so many organizations don't realize just how many people this impacts and affects. And we know that 1 in 6 couples will struggle with fertility issues during the course of their lifetime. And so if you think about that in the context of actually the workforce and the workplace, that's a lot of people bringing some pretty heavy mental challenges with them into the workplace every single day. The more organizations can get comfortable with having these conversations just in an upfront way, I think that means that people can actually bring their whole selves to work and bring their real challenges to work look to their manager perhaps for time off if they need it. Maybe they need to ease back on travel if they're going through an IVF procedure, and really just making sure that people are aware there is a support structure there. But I think there is a huge amount that organizations can do to help support their employees that really we're just embarking on right now. I don't believe that many companies have even scratched the surface. And I know, speaking from my own personal situation, my ability to kind of focus and concentrate going through these fertility challenges at the time, also had an impact on my performance. And my manager had no idea what was going on because, to your point, I chose not to share at that time. And it was only when I opened up that there was this realization of I was going through so much more, and there was a lot of understanding then that came my way, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But I think, I doubt that I'm alone in that situation. I can imagine that anybody going through that, work is not top of mind for you. You're not able to concentrate and focus in the same way as you would normally do. And so I think just being able to talk about it in a really real way in the workplace is a game changer, honestly.
And LinkedIn conducted research, didn't you? And people said that they felt they would feel much better about this if they knew there was some kind of policy in place. But we also know that the policy is just a starting point, isn't it? We need to have that cultural shift, that education, so people actually understand what the policy means. Do you think that there is that understanding, Emma, in the workplace about fertility treatment?
I would say not. I think as a community and society generally, we have failed women and men generally about educating them about fertility. So in my experience, women tend to think about fertility at the moment that they've decided to have a baby. And that might be fine. And biologically, that might have become very, very challenging. And I think corporates, schools, universities have this really amazing opportunity to actually just engage in a conversation. And just by engaging in that conversation, I think the opportunity means that people start to have more information. And when people have information, they can make informed choices. Not because there's a right choice or a wrong choice, but by not having the conversation, there's almost no choice.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the issue.
And we know that once the conversation has started, people feel they can continue the conversation in the workplace. And Lisa, you mentioned about the manager, the line manager. We don't want it to be dependent on it being a good line manager, do we? So when we want to try and encourage organisations to think about how they're educating their staff and their managers, what kind of things have you been doing at LinkedIn?
That you can rely on individual managers to do the right thing on, because maybe they themselves have had an experience. So it really needs to start with what are your policies? How do you think about people who are experiencing miscarriage? How do you think about people who are experiencing IVF? Do you allow for time off during this time, or are you actually asking them to call in sick, which I think sends its own message? Also, then, are you an organization who provides financial assistance to your employees going through this? So we recently rolled out financial assistance for people going through IVF, egg donation, egg freezing, which is pretty great. We rolled it out about 2 years ago. We have seen a huge take up, which I think goes back to my point about 1 in 6 couples experiencing fertility challenges. Almost every single country across the globe, we've had take up on our financial reimbursement assistance. And it's one small area that you can really help people, because it just means that one area, that financial area, that people aren't having to think about, aren't having to worry about how am I going to afford this treatment. And so just doing something like that can really send a powerful message. And as I said, then thinking about the policies that you have in place, that time off allowance. We also provided some training to our managers, almost like a toolkit in terms of how to have these types of conversations. We hosted live in-person events when we could do that pre-pandemic, where we held kind of an open forum. We brought in grief counselors, fertility counselors. A couple of us chaired these different types of sessions, and really just opened the conversation. We had them during working hours in our offices and invited people to attend and just share stories if they were comfortable sharing, or listen to stories if that felt more natural for them. So I think really just trying to break down that stigma at its center. So conversations, manager guides, policies, financial reimbursement, it needs to be a full 360. But I think my advice to any organization is just start somewhere, right? So something is better than nothing. Appreciate that there's a long journey to go on to have full representation and consideration for couples going through this type of experience, or indeed individuals by themselves. So I think, yeah, start somewhere. Think about your policies. Think about your benefits right now. It doesn't need to cost the world, but perhaps even just having, miscarriage leave, right? Just having that enshrined, that people aren't having to say I'm sick and can take the time off when they're experiencing something so life changing.
And think about where, if you've already maybe covered this, and it might be in a policy somewhere, where is it? Because we've had conversations where people have found something about fertility in the maternity policy or in the sickness policy. So it's thinking about this as a separate entity, and the importance then of this being part of how your organisation is going to attract new employees and retain them.
Oh my God, completely. So I can tell you firsthand, as a hiring manager, the amount of people who have applied for roles in LinkedIn who have said, I saw that you do this specific reimbursement on fertility treatment, or I've seen that you started having these conversations as an organization about miscarriage. You're the kind of organization that I want to work for. And so it's actually been part of our talent brand, candidly. I think it's something that, because it impacts so many people, people see a company doing this and actually having these conversations and putting it at the center. And it's the type of organization that they want to work for. So I think there's that talent attraction piece, but then to your point is also the retention piece. So knowing that not all organizations are open and comfortable having these conversations. Most people at some point in their lives will consider, right, potentially starting a family. Not everyone, and I think you also have to balance that out with your other benefits. When you think people who are also not interested in having a family. So I think it's about understanding, what is your population makeup, what are their needs, how are you actually make sure that you're allowing kind of their needs come to the fore, because it's a hot market right now. And we know that people have plenty of options, and if you're not the one giving their options, then they walk next door.
And I'm part of an organisation called Fertility Matters at Work, where we're trying to also highlight the different ways people have their path to parenthood, because we know obviously when a man or a woman needs fertility treatment, but when we're talking about individuals and the different routes, the alternative routes to parenthood, we need to make sure, don't we, Emma, that the organisations understand this. And is this concerns as well that people maybe that are going down that more alternative route, they're having the conversation with you about how do they then talk about that at work if people aren't expecting them to become parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think, we see people, travelling down all different types of paths. There are different scenarios that have led them there. But I think you're right. Someone might look at a young married woman and assume, that person is the person that's going to have a baby, and that just isn't the case anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think, there are same-sex couples journeying through that together. So how does maternity/paternity fit into all of those policies, because they are completely relevant and important to that couple or that individual having a baby.
Now, when we talk about disclosure, and Lisa, I'd love to know your thoughts on this. When people are concerned about having the conversation about their treatment, maybe they want to have it, but they don't want certain perceptions to be made. What advice would you give, Lisa and Emma, about the more challenging conversations if people are nervous about disclosing what they're going through? Because then there's obviously the assumption that there's going to be maternity leave, but we also need employers to understand that if people are going through IVF, it's not a guarantee it's going to work, so they shouldn't assume it's going to just be a cycle. It's going to potentially be a course of treatment.
And I think it's an interesting one, because when you can't really compare it to anything else. So if you think about sick leave, or you think about bereavement, there isn't this saying, but what happens if it, and it almost like, if it works, there's to your point, that taking maternity leave is the successful outcome, right? Or paternity leave, as the case might be. And so I would really say it depends. It depends on what your own comfort levels are. I'm coaching managers to create an environment where people can come and speak openly and honestly, but I also recognize there are organizations where that's just not possible right now. And so I think it's up to the individual to really think for themselves, is this the conversation I want to have with my manager? If it's not, then I think there's other support resources that you can go to. Maybe it's your HR department, maybe it's a colleague, but we spend so much of our time in work. I think it's a real miss not to find at least one other person that you can confide with and have those conversations. And if you're in the office, go for that coffee that you just when you're feeling like the world is against you. It doesn't necessarily have to be your manager if your manager hasn't created that environment where you feel safe. So I do think there's two parts to play here. I don't think we can say to all employees, oh, you should absolutely go tell your manager, because there are organizations, unfortunately, that there will be a penalization for going down this route, because there is that fear factor of, oh, well, I'm a small company, perhaps. If she goes out on maternity leave or if he goes out on paternity leave, I'm going to be a head down. How will I replace that? And they haven't kind of thought through the longer term implications in terms of, this is great talent, I want to retain them. Maternity or paternity leave is a short term event. Like, we're talking about the entire life cycle of somebody's career. So I think it's very much decided in terms of create the environment that sets people up to feel like they can have the conversation. And again, speaking just from personal experience, it took me probably the guts of 7 years to open up and talk about this in the workplace. It was something that I didn't at the time feel I could talk about because of the lack of trust, because of the environment that I was working in. But I know that when I moved to an environment where there was that trust and I felt like I could have the conversation, that was a game changer.
See, I didn't disclose. I was hosting a breakfast radio show and it was quite a male-dominated environment, didn't feel comfortable. So I said I was having medical procedures, which didn't necessarily mean any more questions were asked. But I did have to say what I was going through to my direct team so that we could prepare, because I couldn't just turn up. So then I had to tell them. So then they were asking me how it went. And that can work
with you and
against you, can't it? Because of the challenges of them then asking every single detail. So it's a really fine balance, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's why there isn't a right or a wrong answer. As you say, Lisa, for each person, it depends on your individual circumstances. As you say, what's your employer like, or what's your relationship with your work colleagues like? I just think there isn't a short fix to this, but I think that companies like LinkedIn who are taking this kind of approach actually, is fantastic for their own employees, but actually for other employees puts a lot of pressure on other companies to stand up and say, actually, we do have to think about this. So, I think there's a bit of a domino effect.
And I think, Lisa, you mentioned about the fear, but you've talked about as well the idea of peer support. That can be a starting point. And often when somebody in an organisation maybe takes the initiative and says, this is what I went through, the conversations that I've been privy to, people have said, oh, it's amazing that you did, and now I feel I can talk to you. And it's almost like having that pregnancy loss champion. That's someone, I love this example someone told me, where someone knew what they had gone through, and they knew that somebody was coming into the office with a new baby, and they swept them up and out of the office to go and have a coffee, or they saw that they maybe went into the loo and went to comfort them. And it's having other people, those peers around you, to support you. So companies don't have to be too overwhelmed about where to start. Like you've said, Lisa, it's doing something, isn't it?
Something, exactly. Just starting somewhere. And I think your peers, your team, to your point, they can be your confidence, or your people who you can turn to when times are tough. And that example of somebody bringing a new baby into the office, I think that rings so true for so many of us. It's that deer in the headlights moment of like, how am I supposed to react to her? And can everybody tell from the expression on my face, what's going on inside my head? And again, if the trust isn't there with the manager, I think it's just having that one point of contact that you feel, this is my person who knows, like, I can just do the eyeball thing, and they will know that they're there to help you, which I think is great. But then also employee assistance programs. So our EAPs in a confidential way. If there isn't somebody in the office that you can actually have these conversations with, if your manager is not that supportive, then most organizations do have employee assistance programs that people can tap into in a confidential manner. So maybe you've had that kind of triggering moment, you need to take a step outside, make a quick phone call, and it might just be a quick 10 minutes, right, just to reset yourself. But I think even having that as an outlay that you can set aside for your employees, because it'll cover a broad swath of topics. It doesn't have to be dedicated, right, to miscarriage or to fertility treatments. It can be a multiple of things. And having something like that can be incredibly valuable for your employees.
I want to talk a little bit about the ROI for businesses on fertility benefits, because we know that planned time off is much better, for example, than unplanned time off. And when it comes to like looking at productivity and things like that. So Lisa, it'd be really good to hear your thoughts on that. And then Emma, from the perspective of, we know that scans need to be fitted in according to the cycle. And if people are worried about the distance that they're traveling to their clinic, whether they're going in the morning, whether they're going off to work, so people can understand from the employer point of view that this is very much synced to a woman's cycle.
Yeah.
But that flexibility and also that feeling that somebody can hand over, or that they're not going to be judged if they're walking into the office at a certain time. So Lisa, I don't know if you want to start with that in terms of talking about the importance of flexibility when we're looking at this.
And interesting, I think the pandemic has fast forwarded us somewhat from this flexibility piece, right? There isn't the presenteeism kind of culture that there used to be. More and more of us are working from home. You can see my background. It's definitely not a corporate office environment. So, you can kind of schedule yourself, I think, a little bit more easily. And if you do need to nip out to have those scans, to have your doctor's appointments, it is easier if you're not in the office, full time, 5 days a week. So actually, that has been, I would say, like a pandemic dividend, to use an expression I heard recently. I think that's certainly one of them. So I think that is fabulous. I think the other part of it is your organization one that measures based on results, or is it one that measures based on hours spent sitting at a desk? And I think people are really starting to look at that as they're making decisions about where they want to be long term. And I think just to weave this into a slightly different narrative, which is around the great reshuffle, the great resignation that we've seen happen globally. We've seen a huge spike in attrition through all different industries. And fundamentally, what people are saying, it's because they're rethinking about where they spend and invest their time. And if organizations are not kind of giving people what they need, people will move on. People have other choices. As I said earlier, it's a hot talent market right now. People are in demand. And so I think people can use their feet, right? And if they don't have that flexibility, if they're not the organization for them long term, then I think people will start to prioritize actually their personal, their family lives. And we're seeing more and more of that since the pandemic. So it's interesting how the pandemic has created almost like that, let's relook at what's important to us. And it's also kind of forced us to think about flexibility in a whole different way. And then that, of course, ties into the ROI, right? So if you're the type of organization that is offering, this type of flexibility, which costs us nothing, right, at the end of the day. So this is not something that is only at the purview of massive, corporates. Flexibility and understanding costs absolutely nothing. Then people will stay. That can be your talent brand. That can be a talent differentiator.
Yeah. And when we're talking about the job market, we have to consider different sectors and different working hours. And in the fertility podcast, we've just recently shared a conversation with teachers, and they were just talking about how impossible it was to try and have that flexibility with the hours that they were having to work. Emma, when it comes to that piece about flexibility, and people have maybe got jobs that they're not able to do from home, and there is that stress, what kind of advice do you offer? And also, as well, if people are trying to explain how they can't tell you when, for example, the trigger shot's going to be, because it's so, again, that comes down to educating people on what literally the fertility treatment involves.
Look, I think there's a couple of things. I think that generally fertility treatment should not prevent someone from working. Yeah. So we need about an hour every other day for about 12 days. The day of procedure, we always recommend take the day off work. Going back and making decisions after sedation is probably not a great idea. But actually, the time that we need someone in the clinic is not that onerous. It shouldn't, as Lisa says, interfere with someone's ability to perform and do their job. Having said that, as you say, there are different jobs which that becomes really difficult. So when we meet people like teachers who are very bound by the hours that they need to work, we tend to fit their treatment into school holidays. So we'll plan for that. So we'll say, right, well, let's do it during half term. We can make that work, or do it during the Easter holidays. So I think there's always things that you can do. But I think one of the things that I've seen is that sometimes people just give up. So people actually just quit. And I don't even mean that they quit and they go to a different company. It feels so bleak how they can coordinate their treatment and work that they'll just say to me, well, I quit my job. And I'll say, but why did you do that? They're like, because I just can't keep this secret anymore. And that feels terribly sad and futile.
And again, that whole mental health kind of part is so important here. And Lisa, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, because when we take our work identity out of the picture and our identity just becomes all about our fertility and our struggle to conceive, we lose a lot of who we are, and we're very much not living in the weight. And it's something that we talk about a lot with the work I do with the podcast, is encouraging you to still try and be you in all of this. Lisa, have you had conversations with people worried about that loss of identity when you're trying to educate them about the importance of, I suppose, kind of carrying on and speaking up about what they're going through?
Absolutely. And I think it's a very real side effect. That's a great point. Treatment, it does tend to take over your entire life. Right. And so everything from, are you working out? Do you feel like you've got energy, to the foods that you're eating, to how you're socializing? It's all wrapped up in this, and it can be tremendously all-consuming. And so I absolutely empathize with people. I think it's a great point about, I'm just gonna quit my job. I can't do this anymore. And then interestingly, from the manager's perspective, if they don't know what's happening, there's this narrative of, oh, they were great, but I don't know, they're not that interested anymore, or their performance has gone down. And so if they quit, no, it's not regrettable. When actually what we know is happening is something deeply personal, a huge change going through in their own lives. And if they can have that conversation with their manager can almost take that into account when they're thinking about performance, and can give them that breather. Maybe they don't need to be involved in that high profile project this month. Maybe we can just let them do the day job, and really just give them that breathing space. And then the manager has that. It's important, and I do feel for managers trying to manage people going through this without any insight into what's happening, because there are some pretty big personality shifts when somebody is going through this. Certainly, my conversations with other colleagues who are experiencing this, in terms of just energy level, focus, interest in anything other than fertility, it kind of takes over your whole world. And so I think if a manager isn't in the loop on that, it's very difficult for them to get their heads around what's happened to this previous, great performing individual. Whereas if they're in the loop, as I said, there can be accommodations made.
Like you say, if that someone's not on their A game in that meeting, they'll know what's going on. I'm also keen to just talk a bit about kind of different levels that people might be at. Lisa, when you were going through your treatments and decided to talk about it, what level of seniority you were at? Because obviously there comes an element of confidence the more senior you are. And I'm just interested on your kind of thoughts, and Emma as well. If people are maybe at the early stages in a certain job or in their career, and they don't feel confident about maybe handing over, they don't have the peer support anyway, because maybe they've been in a new job. I've had conversations with people that have started new jobs at the point where they then found out they need to have treatment, and how from an employee you work things through at that stage.
Yeah, completely. I think that's a great point. And the new job thing is real, because I think we carry this guilt around with us about, well, I can't, I've just been given this great opportunity, and if I take a step out now, or if I tell them that I'm going to be doing this fertility treatment, will I pass my probation? There's all these concerns, I think, that people carry and deal with. When I first started my fertility treatment, I was a frontline manager level within the HR organization, and so felt like there was no way I could have that conversation with our VP of HR. He happened to be a man. He happened to be ex-army. Definitely was not the type of individual that you felt you could have that real heart-to-heart conversation with. I went through 3 cycles, none of them worked, and by the third one, I was on the verge of an absolute breakdown, and so it all just sort of came out to him. And he was lovely. I mean, he gave me time off. He was super concerned about me. I had been in the organisation for 10 years, so I thought I had a bit of a track record at that point. I took my break, and then I moved on, and I joined LinkedIn, kind of more at a director level. And when I was at the director level, I felt like I was more of a peer to my manager, and was able to have that conversation a bit more transparently with her. again, it didn't work, but at least it felt like I was able to have the conversation. And then most recently, I'm currently in my third trimester. So this one has finally worked after a decade of trying. And obviously, I did it right after I got my role, which was Vice President of International. And I remember telling my manager, who sits in the US at the start of this year, that this was my number one goal for the year. This was my OKR for the year, was to finally get pregnant and have a baby. And she still went ahead and promoted me mid-year during the summer, even though she knew I was in the middle of doing this. And that just gave me such faith in our organisation, and that we really do believe what we're saying. And no, I feel like so thankful for that. But I'm still being given these opportunities, and actually just being able to have that transparent conversation. It just calms the nerves, and I think it takes a lot of that pressure away, that you're not wondering, how am I going to tell them? You know, are they going to judge me? Are they going to be, regretting, doing the promotion? So yeah, I think it's
amazing.
and it's a one story.
And also, I mean, I've had conversations from the kind of solo motherhood perspective when there's women who have chosen to go down the solo motherhood route, and they're normally pretty high up in their careers because that's enabled them to go down that route. Also having that kind of concern, but then also having that reassurance from their organisation. So I think it's really, really good to hear. And when we're talking about not leaving your job, Emma, you were just saying before, what advice do you give? We're saying don't leave your job, ideally, if you can, have these conversations. But if somebody's having repetitive failed cycles and they're saying to you, something's got to give, is it then a conversation of, okay, we maybe take time out of treatment, but then if age is a factor, it's a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that very much has to be a personal choice, and I don't know about Lisa's experience, but I think that really has to come from the individual. So I guess my point is that some patients just get to the point where they can't cope and something has to give. And because fertility at that point in their life is the most important, it is work that they give up. But I think, as Lisa's saying, there's different ways of approaching it. You know, if they could have an open conversation with their employer, would the employer say, actually, we can put you on a completely different project, which would only need 50% of your time? How would you feel about that? And I think sometimes we're having the conversation in our head and not even having it with the employer.
Yeah.
So we're not even giving them the opportunity to say, well, okay, let's see if we can come up with a solution here. And I think that's part of the education piece, is that actually, why not try and have that conversation first?
Definitely. I think sometimes we can be reluctant to be the educator when we've been through this. And a lot of people speaking out in this space are people that have been through treatment. Charlotte's a wonderful example of this, wanting to help others understand, but you might not always have that confidence to be that educator. But I think we can see how beneficial it is. And when we hear that people have spoken out at work, that other people have come forward. Lisa, I just want to pick up, we've had a question in about the problem being, I'm in a very male-dominated environment, and please do keep your questions coming in, because we've still got some time. Lisa, you mentioned that military-backed boss that you had and how it was a challenging conversation. When people are in a male-dominated environment, I mean, we do know that obviously fertility is an issue that affects men, and we shouldn't overlook the impact it has on men, whether it's male factor infertility or it's men dealing with the loss of a baby loss or a failed cycle and not being able to go to scans and appointments, as we know that's happened all through the pandemic, and men also often feeling very overlooked in the fertility consultation by the professional. So we do need to also think about that educational piece for men. But Lisa, just on that point about the conversation when it's a male-dominated environment, what advice do you give?
Oh, it's hard. It is hard, and I love your call out, because this does impact men, right? This is not a female conversation, and the more we try to make it a female conversation, the more I think we do both ourselves and men a disservice. So actually, I think by having more and more inclusive conversations, by inviting men to be a part of the conversation, by asking them to share their experiences of what it's like to be the partner or the support person, or indeed, if they're in a relationship themselves where they're trying to go through a surrogacy and it doesn't work, or there's a million different ways that men are connected to this challenge of fertility. And And I don't like to get involved in conversations about just female fertility, because this is about all of us. Um, and so thinking back to the day where I had that conversation with my manager at the time, it was really just a point of no return for me. And exactly to the point made earlier, it was like I was either leaving or I was getting some time off. And it was I still remember walking into his office, and just like my face, I'm sure, was like the color of a beetroot. I was just like, my blood pressure was through the roof. I was so stressed out. I was seriously depressed. And it was just like, I either don't show up for work tomorrow and I've resigned, or you're giving me this time off. And I think the poor guy just didn't know where any of this was coming from, because I had been just masking, and I had been, covering all of this heartache and anguish for so long. And I had just hit this breaking point. And so actually, I feel bad because I didn't handle that in the best possible way. I often think back and wish I'd had, you know, more conversations with him earlier in the process that would have given him some insight that this was actually happening to me, because he was going in blind. He had no idea any of this was happening. And he tried to help, I mean, he was just like, take the time. And it was just, he was, he just wanted to end the conversation. I think get out of the room and just, call me when you feel better. Um, but I think, he was, as I said, quite old school army, and just didn't really know, how to deal with it. I do think that's the extreme. I think the more we include men in the conversation, the more comfortable they're going to be engaging and understanding and interacting. But it's going to require a degree of education as to just how impactful this is, especially if you're a man who's never experienced anything like this and has had kind of no connection to that world of infertility. It's new. It's an education journey for them, and I think we need to help them on that journey of education.
Well, it's educating men. Sorry to interrupt you. It's educating men about, like you've just described, but it's also highlighting that this is a safe space for men to talk about these issues. It's not your average conversation at a footy match or in the pub. However, we do know that it is a 50-50 male-female factor. We do know that there's a kind of an increase in certain protein shakes, for example, that are impacting men's sperm health. It's a conversation we'll be having later on the IVF network, but I think that understanding is a huge part of the education. You just mentioned, Lisa, about feeling bad when you kind of, reacted like you did, and we're kind of going back to where we started, talking about the mental health implications of all of this. And I think a lot of us, women especially, put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do things the right way and not make somebody else feel bad. When it comes to reaching out for support, Lisa, you mentioned about that being a part of the work that LinkedIn are doing, and Emma, when people are coming to you, I'm always really keen to highlight, get support, talk to somebody as early as you can, rather than feeling like you just can't, you're at breaking point, you're in that dark place. And when we think of how much we give to work, what is it, like 40 to 60 hours a week, that we're there trying to be present, bringing our whole self. How important is it for somebody to know that they need to get additional support with this early on, would you say, Emma?
I think it's really important. I think that, counselling has we think, a massive role to play in fertility treatment. We provide it as part of our care and encourage patients to do it. You would be surprised how few do.
I know, yeah.
Even when there's no charge for it, even then patients are not taking it up, and I think that's such a shame.
Because something in the UK about the stigma around therapy, isn't there?
But I think, and I think the word stigma is really important, because I think there is still stigma, shame around needing help with fertility, particularly for men. Actually, I think women are becoming more open about it, but I think particularly for men, and I think also around baby loss. That, it's still this terrible silent grief that people find really, really difficult to share. Yeah. And to go back to work the next day or even the same day is really difficult. Yeah. And, I think having additional outside support, whether that's a counsellor, whether that's some of the fantastic, support a podcast that you are providing or online forums, which, you know, patients find real support from. Find your space, find your people. It could even just be a person, but try and find that to help you through that journey.
And Lisa, we've seen how important the mental health conversation has become in the workplace. The pandemic has heightened it so much so, and it's almost encouraging organisations to connect the dots, isn't it, between what this whole fertility conversation looks like and probably the mental health work that they're already doing when they're, you know, talking about the diversity and inclusion and their wellbeing policies and all the work that they're already probably implementing.
Absolutely. But I think there's always more we can do.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think we should rest on our laurels. I think that's my takeaway from all the conversations I've had, is that, you know, one policy, you know, one benefit is not enough. That this is something that impacts people in different ways and at different times. And I think there is always more that we can do to help try to support and just move that stigma. I think that word is so spot on. Move that stigma away and actually treat it for what it is, which is something that impacts 1 in 6 couples. As I said at the start, this is a global issue. This is something that, you know, a lot of people will experience in their life, can create physical, mental challenges that can last for years. And unless we are building systems into our workplaces to help people, then we're failing.
And we've seen the interest that has come around the whole menopause conversation, and I feel really strongly that this fertility conversation is next on the agenda, because if people are thinking logically about it, it's part of the same conversation, isn't it? Do you feel the same, both of you, that the energy is coming, that organisations, obviously with yourselves, with LinkedIn, really leading the way and showing how important this conversation is, but also you're already showing the rewards that your workforce are feeling from feeling that they are being listened to and looked after better? That this has to be the next big thing.
I completely agree. I just think we're not seeing it yet. So on the front line, I don't think we're seeing that impact yet. I think the success will be that future generations, hopefully the generation below us, will just think this is normal. Will just think it's completely normal to have it as part of their workplace conversation. But I don't see it yet from a patient perspective.
And Lisa, do you feel the shift? You know, obviously LinkedIn is one of the trailblazing organisations. We've heard more and more. We spoke on the podcast with Channel 4 about their pregnancy loss policy, and they were talking openly about how people were saying it made them feel so proud to be at an organisation like Channel 4, and I'm sure you've had the same at LinkedIn.
I think it's more the exception rather than the rule, to Emma's point about the front lines. So I think we still have a journey to go on to make it just completely standard, that this is just part and parcel of the way you think about, you know, your policies and your benefits, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that organizations who are putting this at the forefront are the exception and not the rule. It makes me super proud to work for a company like LinkedIn, and to hear those other stories like the Channel 4. But I think this just needs to become the standard.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Lisa and Emma, for joining us and for your invaluable insights. Thank you as well for those of you joining our sessions. We really hope it was helpful, and we hope that you found all the content interesting. We'd love you to check out the rest of the events on the IVF Network, and do send us your feedback because we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.